Chapters 19 through 21 of the Fallout fanfiction work, Paul's Letter to Rome. Narrated by Hannah Young, daughter of Lieutenant Paul Young, of the new Canaan Guard, 2277. Chapter 19, Booted from Paradise, Part 1. Around 2 weeks later. It was early December, and the preparatory works for the holy season began only 1 week previously. Christmas was fast approaching, and as the winds and nights got colder, there was much to do. Christmas time in my home was particularly wonderful, and although something happened in the nuclear holocaust of 2077 to disturb the weather patterns I'd read about, it was especially cold, and we even experienced a few days of light snowfall. The town was alive and comfortable as families and groups and trades within the walls prepared for the season by getting done with their work and signing up for work groups or charity events special for the Christmas season. The smoke from chimneys poured into the air above the town all day and all night, and the work went on. Every day, and especially days my detachment was in the towers, we'd see the kids would leave school, and trades would end their shifts only to fill the streets and begin happily putting up decorations throughout town. Lights were strung up along the street lamps. Nativity scenes would show up in every community garden. The construction groups would decorate the temple. The storefront of every shop and trade building would be strewn in lights, and all the while the soft sounds of new Canaanites caroling as they worked would come to us up in the gate towers. The market and world outside the walls were a strange contrast. Every day, groups of refugees were coming to us, and although the charity groups and missions coordination were working overtime, the refugee crisis was becoming more of a routine than anything. The way we've been handling it was working well enough, and many new Canaanites thanked Mr. Mathers for his renovation project a couple of months back, while he reminded them to thank God. Because of his and his workers' job at the former ranch of our former Bishop Judah Black, we now had a completely dedicated station for managing the refugee crisis. Although the work was continuous, the missionary and charity groups and guardsmen assigned to that refugee town had their work cut out for them. At this time, the refugee handling station truly was more like a separate town. Perhaps nearly 200 or more refugees occupied the area with several dozen tents, and missionaries were sent out all the time, leading them to new homes in the wilderness only for new groups to replace them. Although the groups were mostly from the east, we still received them from all over, and the missions teams were doing their sometimes thankless work, ignited by the spirit of the holy season, shown in the glow behind the walls. As the sky got dark, the days were slow for the most part at the start. Every few days my detachment was sent to the refugee town where we helped keep order, even if it seemed like many days we weren't even needed. Perhaps the incident with Graham at the start of the crisis still resonated amongst the refugee population. Perhaps it was because of the increasing cold of the season. Or perhaps it was because of the refugees' quarantine from those who'd seek to exploit the charity. Either way, the work with the refugees was peaceful for the most part. And still, the work went on. Although the market was free from much of the general refugee traffic, business in the markets went on fairly normally with traders from all over the wilderness and further. Many who came to the markets were from lands beyond the wilderness, and many still were here from the surrounding wastes. While many traders enjoyed having a steady customer base with the population of New Canaan and the refugees, much of the business was done with us and their fellow tradesmen, since so many of the refugees didn't have much other than the clothes on their backs. Still, the weather got colder, and due to wars in the east between the tribes and Legion, and war in the west between the White Legs and 80s, many of the traders found it best to stay put for a while in the safety of New Canaan's direct vicinity. By the start of the first week in December, all of the temporary lodging shacks in and around the market were occupied by traders and wasters. And it was shortly after this that the guards' patrols of the market grounds began to come upon an issue we had to deal with nearly every cold season. It turns out that those traders who decide to lodge under our protection seem to forget how weird they think we are, and are surprised when they learn they have to play by our rules when under our protection. A lot of traders, especially those from lands beyond the wilderness, like NCR lands in the west, or settlements up north, come to us with open minds, even if they aren't very willing to participate in the real reason our community is around. No matter the season, traders from outside begin to grumble when they learn they can't get a stiff drink or alcohol from New Canaan-owned businesses in the market, like the Trinity Inn. Their frustration becomes even more so when they realize our community won't tolerate prostitution either, and decide they'd keep a lid on it, knowing they could get their vices satisfied to abundance after a very short stay at New Canaan. Some come to terms with it, and sometimes even attend the little scrap-built chapel outside the walls to see if the God of Abraham and New Canaan can help them cope with the lack of what they can't get in our territory. Those traders or wasters who remain uninterested in the Lord seek to subvert our rules and then turn to their own stocks of alcohol or sometimes even drugs while they are with us. This particular is true no matter the season. We guardsmen don't particularly mind if traders sell one another alcohol or drink their own stocks, and so long as they don't attempt to sell to New Canaanites in the market, they remain free to do as they wish, while drug or chem use is strictly forbidden while in public. That isn't to say drug and chem use doesn't happen when we're looking the other way, but while drug use and distribution normally result in expulsion or confinement to a cell till the drugs are gone, the use of alcohol is dealt with in a far more lenient manner. Overall, the men of the Guard typically try not to look down on those who partake in their vices, provided they aren't causing too much of a disturbance because of it. In fact, I've seen a waster stumble out of his tent or rented shack with a bottle in his hands, only for a guardsman to stop him and ask to pray for him many times. That's usually as far as it goes regarding alcohol, accompanied by the guardsman gently telling them something along the lines of, "You don't need that." Funnily enough, drunk people are sometimes the most interested and willing to listen to what the men in black police vests and caps with crosses on them have to say about Jesus Christ. I only bring all that up because in the second week of December, while New Canaan was still preparing for Christmas, the men of my detachment were sent to put an end to something that culminates every season, when the rented lodgings are full, and the traders decide they don't want to put up with our regulations for more than a week. Usually, we don't care what the wastelanders or ambitious businessmen from beyond the wilderness decide to sell outside the markets. But the enterprise was a bit too close to us for comfort, and even more problematic because of the name they decided to call it. Not only this, but I think the operation I will go on to explain was something of a turning point. I believe it was after this operation and this Christmas season that formally marked the start of all the problems I've laid forth since the beginning, finally accumulating enough to start showing in the new year. A sort of calm before the storm, if you will. "So, what's the name of this place?" asked Nathan idly, looking at the dark wastes around us. All to our east and south was darkness, while the lights of the lanterns across the market and bright Christmas lights from the town proper illuminated the world behind us. Our path, the caravan path south from the gates to our home, was still faintly lit by the dim glow of lanterns and campfires along the trail, as the only other source of light in this darkness was the small collection of fires, and dim neon southwest off the trail on our right. "You forget to read the signs, or what?" asked Carl Northrup, adjusting the shoulder straps of his small pack, himself looking much wider than he normally was in that big padded jacket made from the scraps of probably 20 other jackets. We all look at the sign up ahead, sitting between two dim lanterns and reflecting the glow of a nearby fire keeping 6 wasters and refugees warm. The sign was nearly identical to every 5th sign we passed since leaving the market grounds and reading, "Come to Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden." And below that, "Next right green sign." We ignored the group of refugee men talking loudly in their tribal dialect following us in the same direction. But we decided to turn off the path before reaching the green sign with lanterns beside it reading, "Paradise 1 mile this way." Paradise would have been hilarious if the whole energy around this little enterprise wasn't so frustrating for many reasons I'll illuminate later. Reflecting on the other signs we've read since leaving the last shacks around the market and passing the refugee town said things like, "Everything you can't find in New Canaan found this way. Come get high and drink with an arrow pointing further south. All sinners welcome at A and EPG. As we got closer to the destination, the group of us felt increasingly uncomfortable with every group of wasters or refugees that passed us whooping and hollering as they headed in the same direction as us. We looked and felt like idiots in our patchwork garb of jackets and pants sewn together by the seamstress groups at home and scavenged from department stores probably 100 years prior. There must have been rats in my jacket before it was pulled from the storeroom for this assignment, because every part of it was frayed and stringy and bore an awful smell before the night breeze carried most of that scent away. Still, we all looked the part, and beyond looking like any other group of wasters, we were all still concealing our .45 pistols beneath our jackets. Perhaps the only thing that could give us away was the cleanliness of our faces, except for Nathan and Ramos, who decided to smudge dirt on them before I said I didn't think that was necessary. As we turned off the caravan path and stepped onto the rugged wasteland, Ramos asked the group in general, what was the name of that mobile one they did last year around this time? I forget. He didn't forget, and John and I said as much at the exact same time. Still, Nathan took the bait or leapt at the opportunity, asking, "You mean that restored camper unit getting led around by a team of Brahmin?" "That's it. What was that called again?" asked the youngest man in my detachment, knowing full well what he was doing. Before Nathan could utter the first syllable, I told him without any humor in my voice, "You say it and you're getting put in the night guard." The distant sounds of laughter and chatter from the groups of wasters and refugees going to and from the lighted establishment were the only things to be heard beneath the winds and the sounds of our footsteps for a long moment. Then, I contemplated once more whether or not I felt Mr. Langdon to be my second in command when he answered Mr. Ramos's question, the pussy wagon. Mr. Langdon mouthed something to the sky. My men contained their laughter as we neared the path to the brothel of today, and then Mr. Langdon considered how I would punish him later. Carl then asked simply, "Why we gotta look like wasters if we're doing a show of force?" "This isn't the show of force," said I. "This is the we'll ask you kindly once more part of this situation." "Oh, okay," said Carl, followed by John Langdon. "After this, we'll do the show of force. From there, it's up to them to decide whether or not we move on to the 'I hope you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior' part." Nathan chuckled, Ramos shrunk back a few paces behind, and we stepped on the path. A gaggle of drunk wasters stumbled our way looking like black silhouettes in the glow of the fires and restored neon signs behind them. The establishment sat little less than a mile straight ahead. Carl rubbed his hands to combat the cold and stole a glance toward New Canaan and all its bright Christmas wonder before saying idly, "Never came to this last year with the proprietor of the wagon." "And I pray it goes no further than this," said I before John asked the group. "You boys hear what they did to Daryl from Missions Outreach yesterday?" I nodded, remembering what I heard and why I volunteered my detachment for this. Hearing Ramos give a low "uh-huh" behind me, Carl and Nathan were in the barracks at the time, and I had Ramos bring me some files for guard interviews last night when John came to my door with the news he heard from the constable. With Nathan and Carl ignorant, Carl asked, "Daryl Fleischer, what happened?" I spoke for John. Man was sent to give New Canaan's demands. A simple "move 8 miles south and change your name" request was met with some disagreement. "Disagreement?" asked John with a shake of his head. "These scumbags did more than that. They decided to." He stopped himself at the look I gave him, and the group of wasters was too close for us to talk, although they may have been too drunk to figure out who we were regardless of what we were saying. The collection of brightly lit trailers around a wide run-down building was a bit closer now, and the group of wasters passed us whooping and hollering with colorful bits directed at us and each other like, "Best night of my life. Ya guys'll love it, thur. My bish was hot. Why ya always pick the Uggos Clyde? Screw New Canaan. We do what we want. And I'm tellin' ya, Bill. No booze, no chems. Legion and Canaan's the same." Personally, I would have laughed at the Wastelander logic, a community that doesn't permit alcohol, prostitution, and drugs equal to Caesar's Legion, but I was a bit too focused on the task ahead at the time. Soon enough, the wasters passed, and as we neared the establishment, The quiet in my group only ended when Nathan muttered to nobody in particular, "Wish Graham was here for this," alluding to his noteworthy incident in the market a couple weeks back. Was the response from everyone, including John, while I stayed silent, not sure what to make of the statement and mutual opinion from my men. I felt myself about to ask in all honesty why he said that. However, I already knew the answer since the incident in the market was still being talked about, and before I could ask it, Carl asked me, "Hey, LT, you mentioned where he's living now, but what has he been up to?" I didn't really know the answer to that, although I did mention what he said over dinner that first night and how he might come to the ranks of the Guard at some point in the distant future. However, before I could say anything, Nathan said what all of us have at least noticed over the past week. "Guys putting up Christmas lights, remember? We saw him the other day." That was true. And it really was something else to see that burnt and wrapped man up on a ladder with the others stringing up lights around lampposts and along the trim of buildings. There was always someone holding his ladder, and he was always with the regular population as he worked. I didn't know if he was ordered to do this or just volunteered, but it certainly was strange to know that man's past, know what he did in the market, and then to see him decorating for the holiday with the rest of the new Canaan population, just before the end of our detachment's shift. At that, I thought about the days since he'd moved out of my family's home. Whenever our detachment was assigned to one of the towers, I'd think back to Joseph's diary assignment he got back a day after turning it in, and then I'd turn to look back at the town. More often than not, whenever I did, I'd see Joshua Graham wandering the streets by his lonesome while the rest of the town was with their trades or working their shops. In those first days, I remember that of the few people who walked the streets in the midday, almost all of them would go around him. Even if there were words spoken, I was always too far to hear. Even when the trades and shops and schools would let out, the same thing would occur. The streets would fill, but still, Graham would walk, going about his strange business and looking like a rock in the middle of a stream as everyone passed around him. Then I thought of the last time I'd seen him walk the town not more than 2 days ago. Sometime before we caught sight of him stringing up lights with one of the many volunteer holiday decorator groups. I remember seeing everyone he passed wave to him. Graham would wave back to every single one with his wrapped arm, even as the streets filled with the end of the day. It occurred to me how not one person would avoid him or fail to give him a wave as he passed. A stark contrast to how the populace felt about him in the immediate days after his integration into the town proper. My thoughts were broken as another group of wasters passed us drunkenly hollering at one another, and a group of tribals screamed and made wild gestures at each other in their own dialect. The establishment was closer now, and we weren't more than 150 yards from the campfire surrounded by crowds of men beside the entryway when I spoke the order. "Listen up, boys." I felt their wordless acknowledgement and resumed. "When we get inside, we find Lieutenant Doyley and, I think, Lieutenant Pryor, husband of Joseph's teacher, Mrs. Pryor, and see where they want us. Both of them, as well as their men, should be there now." I heard a few mumbled affirmations as the group of wasters in our rear grew slightly louder. "We're blending in, so do what you can to not draw attention to yourselves or anyone else. Engage with any women who approach you. And although I'm sure I don't need to say this, but you are not to do anything beyond casual discourse." I heard Carl push Ramos off the path, followed by the short remark, "Remember, you're saving yourself for marriage, baby boy." Ramos caught up, John chuckled, and Nathan asked strangely seriously for the question he had. "Are we supposed to drink to help us fit in? Thugs might get suspicious if there are so many in there asking for water or tea." I thought about this too and went on, somewhat surprised he didn't ask the question in his usual sarcasm. "I'll see what Doyle and Pryor have decided when we get there, but we're just waiting on Lieutenant Camden to show up and give us a sign to start the shutdown. I'll figure out what that sign is later, but remember our secondary task on any assignment like this." John, Nathan, and Carl made an sound, and I went on for Mr. Ramos, who's never been on an assignment like this that went as far. "If you see any of our brothers or sisters inside the premises, you are to approach them discreetly, take down their names, and order them to leave without commotion." The boys were silent, allowing me to add, "It doesn't happen that often. But our brothers and sisters have been discovered in places like this before, so keep eyes open and look at the younger men inside especially. We're here." At that, we were inside the glow of the 2 crowded fires beside the chain-link fence to the premises. Ignoring the laughter and talking amongst those huddled around the flames, we also ignored the terrible fight happening somewhere off to our right just beyond the glow, and proceeded onward. Usually, assignments like this were carried out by older or married members of the Guard, since the younger ones, such as Ramos, Carl, and Nathan, were more susceptible to the temptations of a brothel. However, I mentioned the Guards were short-staffed, and although it wasn't hard to muster the right amount of bodies for a task like this, it was hard to acquire the particular kinds of bodies like married ones for it. Either way, my thoughts were cut short when a bald probable caravan guard turned bouncer, thug covered in leather ammo pouches over his jacket, said, "Welcome to Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden." We nodded. I felt the urge to throw up at the mention of such a name for a place like this, and it didn't help when the woman in an almost identical leather outfit laden in ammo bandoliers held a bowl out to us saying, "Need condoms?" Nobody has sex without one. She didn't say has sex. I extended my hand to the bowl to fit in. She retracted the thing and said, 5 caps, or 5 bullets, 9 mil up. Without a word, I pulled 5 .45 bullets out of my pocket, took the prophylactic, and the transaction was over in 2 seconds. Without slowing our pace, we continued onward toward the brick building all lit up. I briefly thought that I should have brought 9mm bullets, or 10mm, since New Canaanites were known across the Utah wilderness to use .45 almost, exclusively in our standard sidearms and submachine guns. Although the bouncer didn't seem to notice or care, the type of weapon that shoots .45 was fairly common amongst the tribes and wasters of the wilderness. Passing the welcome crew and stepping inside the compound, I think we all simultaneously realized why the constable required such a large crew for this job. It was a circus. Beyond the large white crosses painted crudely on the faces of the central building, and the sign Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden spelled out across the top with neon letters from probably 30 different signs, what really captured me was the grounds before the building. I didn't know what happened inside the building, but I assumed that was where the bar was, because the place sat in the middle of an old trailer park. Seeing women leading men to different trailers under the dim lamps and campfires, I assumed the trailers were where the brothel services were engaged. But the lively theme and lights of the place weren't what really caught my attention after stepping inside. As we neared the building, it really shocked me at how crowded the place was. We did our best to scan the crowds for any brothers or sisters to confront and usher away, but there were far too many concealed by the darkness, despite the electric signs, campfires, and restored lampposts. Between the 2 long trailers flanking the entrance and the building, there must have been a half-dozen camp or barrel fires, each surrounded by crowds of men, many with bottles in their hands, and far more noise than we were used to. The gimmick was apparently working well for the owners. There must have been well over 100 men just between the entrance to the compound and the building alone, and the whole place appeared to be a regular den of sin, or something everyone in the wilderness knew about. Overall, the sight made me sorry that there were so many men who didn't want to find any kind of alternative to their vices while they were in New Canaan jurisdiction. However, I will admit that the entire Brahmin carcass roasting over a giant spit in front of the trailer on our left was rather impressive. The fellows in charge of that were charging for a sliver, and it smelled so good I almost stopped by for one. But we were soon stepping up to the door to the brick structure, and passing the bouncer with a nod as we stepped inside. Chapter 20, Booted from Paradise Part 2. I was apparently wrong. It appeared that the trailers weren't the only place the brothel services were carried out, if the horrendous smell that entered my nose upon entry to the establishment proper was any indication. I kept my composure, and assumed my men did too, as we shuffled past the dirty wasters and refugee men crowding the entrance before we went under a wide doorframe. Another woman bouncer told us to enjoy our stay and pointed out the bar on the far side of the large open room. Past the crowds and over the heads of the dozen completely occupied tables, I scanned the room. There were nearly as many people in here as there were outside. Dozens of wasters, refugee men, and women in dirty short mishmash dresses went to and fro or occupied all the tables. I scanned the room, my men behind me scanning as well. All the while we took in the smell of over 100 dirty bodies in a packed room. The smell of sweat, cigarette smoke, alcohol, grease, paint, and even gunpowder, all beneath the overpowering smell of sex filled our noses. Then I saw them. There at a table near the left end of the long bar was a table with 6 chairs packed around it with Lieutenant Doyle at the head and Lieutenant Pryor beside him. Beside Pryor appeared to be Duncan Schmidt, and the rest of the chairs were empty. All of us nearly unrecognizable in our wastelander garb. Doyle caught eyes with me by the entrance with my men and made a motion with his head. I pointed out Doyle to John, and he led the boys past me towards the table before I followed in the rear. Through the crowds we went. John, Nathan, and Ramos took their seats at Doyle and Pryor's table when a group of drunk men stumbled past me. I took the opportunity to scan the room again, noticing most of the women, whether they were on the laps of men, talking in corners, or leading men to private places. Most bore the sun-touched skin and garb of women we'd seen in the refugee village around the old ranch of Judah Black. The discovery of who these prostitutes were and how they were so many of the ones my brothers and sisters in the refugee camp tried to help made me sad. As I looked around, I felt very strange, seeing many of the apparent refugee prostitutes were so differing in their faces. Some sat on the laps of men, laughing with the men at the tables. Some were standing in the corners with solemn faces, as crowds of men gathered around them. Some of the prostitutes were bruised and wearing fake smiles, while refugee men stood close by and scowled at the women, as if to say these prostitutes' wives or daughters were being forced into pleasing the customers. The diversity and overall sadness amongst the majority of women selling themselves had already set my mind on the immediate shutdown of this place as soon as possible. Yet there was something else that only confirmed this in my eyes when I saw a group of young girls, perhaps between 13 to 16, standing in one of the far corners wearing worried looks as even more groups of men gathered around them. I didn't know if the girls in that corner were only there while their mothers or older sisters worked, but even the possibility of those girls so young acting as prostitutes made my rage build, and I promised I'd confirm the situation myself or with Doyle before the operation began. Then, my rage cooled, and my mind went elsewhere for the moment when my eyes landed on one woman who wasn't bearing the standard appearance of a refugee prostitute. The pale woman reclining against a wall beside 2 drunk men arguing with one another was staring at me. She was clearly a prostitute as well, but when I caught her eye, she motioned with her hand for me to approach. I looked back to Doyle and caught his gaze, and he was already engaged with John, Nathan, and Ramos. I gave him a nod, and he gave me one back, and my message had been communicated. I'll blend in, and you catch my boys up on the plan. I turned back to the prostitute leaning against the wall. She'd obviously begun scanning for new potential customers when I looked away, but upon catching eyes with me again, she made the same gesture as before, and I approached. As I maneuvered around the packed tables and through the drunks stumbling around, the arguing men beside the pale prostitute were pushing each other towards the exit, and I stepped up to the woman. She certainly wasn't a refugee woman, neither in physical build or complexion, nor by what she was wearing. She was fairly pretty for a regular waster, looking mid-20s with long dark hair, somewhat pale ashy skin, tall black dusty boots, short jean shorts, and if I wasn't sure she was a prostitute by what I wrote above, her bare skin from the waist up was exposed between the flaps of the unbuttoned whitish fur coat. Since there weren't any signs of a bra in the exposed portion of her chest, that seemed to confirm it. I positioned myself close by, leaned myself back up against the wall beside her, and looked out over the room, ready for a casual conversation before I inevitably declined her offer. I was surprised when the first thing she said beneath the noise of the packed establishment was, "Are you and your new Canaan buddies here to shut us down?" It took a moment for me to register what she said, mostly because it was the way she said it. The way she asked that was almost as seductive as if she was telling me what she would allow me to do to her if I paid the right price. I glanced at her. Those dark red lips curled into a smile in the dim yellow lighting, and she gestured towards the table where Doyle and Pryor sat with my men. "Why would you think that?" I asked, trying not to give her the impression those words affected me the way they did. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see that smile widen. I can spot new Canaanites a mile off, even if the bouncers are too stupid to do it too. The three at that table before you showed up haven't had one sip of the drinks in front of them the past 10 minutes. I noticed that too. Just as Nathan asked earlier, Doyle and Pryor did indeed authorize the men to get drinks. Although the glasses before Doyle, Pryor, and Mr. Schmidt were mostly full, it did appear there was some of it they'd consumed. The comment from the woman on my left merely showed that they ordered the drinks, but they certainly weren't enjoying it, unlike almost everyone else in the establishment. Just then, my eyes scanned the room once more, and suddenly, it appeared as if a great many of the wasters had disappeared, and the rest of Doyle and Pryor's men were all I could see throughout the establishment. All I could say to the woman's observation was, "You just see them, huh?" Giving a nod towards Doyle's table as my eyes landed on Hudson and Ray standing beside the two bouncers by the entrance. Both of them were talking, and it appeared Ray was the only one enjoying the permission to drink based on the amount of liquid left in his glass. "I know there's more of you," said the woman, still looking at Doyle's table as she went on. "Those three are just the most obvious before your buddies sat down. Want to know how else I can prove you're a new Canaanite?" As she spoke, my eyes found Lockwood and Mitchell standing together close to two other bouncers by the entrance to a hall across the room. On the right side of the bar and near two other bouncers were Ankra and Lominori, two tribal converts part of Pryor's detachment, who I almost didn't recognize. The two tribal guardsmen stood near the edge of a table filled with their brethren of the wilderness, blending right into the surroundings. I landed on a total of 10 guardsmen in the establishment, but I knew from the constable's brief that Pryor and Doyle had brought at least a few more. Still, I felt myself absently answer the prostitute's question of how else she could prove I was a new Canaanite with a simple, "How's that?" As my eyes landed on McMahon standing beside the bar, engaged in conversation with a bouncer, my focus returned to the woman beside me when I caught her glance down at my hand. Then it returned even more when I felt her fingers gently turning the wedding ring on my finger. I clenched my hands into fists, knowing women of her type usually weren't above stealing, but she only gripped my hand even softer. Her finger tapped on my ring, and she then proved her point even more as she whispered, "My standard price is 4 Canaan coins or 50 bullets 9 mil up for 10 minutes. Just for you, though, I'll give you a full hour for 1 coin, no limits." She paused, smiled even wider when she saw my face, and purred, "I'm serious too. Trailer 8 should be free now." Immediately I stuffed my hand in my pocket, double-checking that my ring was firmly on, and replied simply, "Maybe if I was younger, unmarried, and if I didn't see my eldest daughter when I look at a girl as young as yourself. Thanks for the offer, though." She retreated, placing her hand in her own pocket as she nearly choked in amusement. "Ha, I like you godly men. Particularly the younger ones, no offense. Had a man like your friend over there but 2 nights ago." As relieved as I was for her to switch targets, my comfort level was still far below normal levels when she gestured towards the table. It was hard to tell if she was pointing at Mr. Ramos or Duncan Schmidt, since he sat across from Mr. Ramos. Either way, I irrationally felt the 2 near boys were in immediate danger, and I remained very uncomfortable. Seeing her propose new targets, my young friends of the guard, I felt the nearly overpowering urge to rush over and hug the 2 of them and keep them safe in this den of wicked women. All I could say in response to what she said about her previous customer was, "You catch the guy's name? Or know who his parents are?" She was smart and returned her attention to me, saying, "Yes, I did, but that's between him and I. Telling on my clients their parents or wives is bad for business. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand. I also didn't like the way she winked at me when she said wives with that peculiar emphasis. I was done being toyed with, and after all the distractions this woman was excellent at creating, I remembered how she began our talk and said, "So you know there's a lot of new Canaanites here tonight? What's your point? You gonna report to the bouncers or something?" Then she reminded me of the other part of her introduction, saying, "I just can't imagine why a man who turns down an offer like the one I gave you would come here with so many of his friends. You know, other than to shut us down, of course. I also imagine you're packing tonight, and not just that snake in those ill-fitting trousers." At this, I brushed my hand against the grip of the pistol on my right hip, and nearly jumped when she brushed her hand against the part of me reserved for my wife alone. At the same time, she said the word snake. The face I made must have been something sinister or righteous, because she returned her hand to the pocket of her coat in an instant and chuckled before I physically shook my head back into focus and asked her, "So what if we are here to shut this place down?" While doing my best to make sure my volume wasn't too high and internally screaming, "You may be able to tempt Eve, but you can't tempt me and my men, you snake." It was true she wasn't that attractive to me, despite how young and pretty she was for a woman of the wastes, but even if her charms were more than enough to tempt the men of Ramos and Duncan's age, her charms were definitely enough to at least throw me internally off balance. Either way, the moment sobered up, and perhaps she realized the level of my discomfort, because she turned it all down a notch and replied to the question. "So what if we are here to shut this place down again, in a way I didn't expect? What's New Canaan's problem with prostitutes anyway? I thought Christ preferred the company of prostitutes over priests?" Then I guessed it was my turn to throw her off balance because I returned automatically, "I suppose that's something else he and I have in common." She really must have not been expecting that, because she snorted loudly to stifle a laugh. She and I remained in our own bubble within the packed room as she collected herself and asked, "You spend a lot of time with prostitutes? You certainly don't act like it." I shrugged. "Give me the chance to talk to the elders or talk to you. I think I'd prefer you. If not for services, then at least for amusement." "Never had a man in the white robes, so I'm curious," said the woman, her chosen topics of conversation and suggestion of familiarity with our church just now catching up to me as she asked, "Did you get your orders to show up tonight from the elders and bishop, or from God?" All of that again was said in a strangely sexual manner, and even if the latter part was said with malicious intent, it certainly didn't feel that way when I looked at her young face and saw that smile. Then, her seemingly intimate familiarity with New Canaan came to me again as her words caught up with me. I squinted my eyes in study of her face and a mind filled with recollections of home when my mouth spoke for me. "Lila Yetter?" The young woman's face didn't change one bit as she replied very coolly, and with that smile, "Callie Carson. Carson ain't my real surname. Earned that for a hollow film I did in Carson City. Still not a Yetter, though." She extended the hand from her pocket towards me. "You?" I shook her hand, Paul Young, and both our hands returned to our pockets when she asked, "Who's Lila Yetter?" "Just a girl," said I before looking back to survey the room, adding, "Ran away from home to maybe 3 years back. Smart girl, wasn't home from mission for 3 months when she left." I let the rest die, and the young woman took in the view as well. "Got tired of being the perfect Christian girl and went to make her own way in the world, huh? By opening her legs for anyone who comes asking about price?" "Yeah," said I. "Still happens once every few years." I felt her gaze return to the side of my head and added, "Thought you might have been her." The woman's gaze went back to the surroundings as she said, "That's how you thought I knew so much about you all?" She was right, that was how I thought it. But since the girl wasn't the long-lost Lila Yetter, I lost interest, and figured her to have just grown up in a nearby township before finding herself in Carson City, Nevada. This lack of further interest was much to Callie Carson's sadness. I felt her look back at me, seemingly troubled by my lack of response to her question. After a moment, she'd moved on as well, telling me, "You still didn't answer my question about why you're here." I turned to her, feeling slightly unnerved about his stranger's flippant questions about me and my faith. I felt even stranger still that she wasn't a lost lamb, just someone who knew more than they should, but with seemingly plenty of judgments and wit about things they didn't truly understand. I turned to face her. "Am I here because of the word of the elders or the word of God?" She nodded, face still calm and that mouth still smiling almost gently or even understandingly. "Sure," Without even looking at her, I studied the faces across the room, seeing all the prostitutes of so many ages, and seeing all the dirty, unshaven, cackling faces of so many intoxicated wasters. I caught eyes with almost all of the guardsmen in the room very briefly as I answered her question. I'm here because I see the kind of scum who congregate at places like this. Because I see so many women here who degrade themselves out of desperation. Because the women here, including yourself, deserve better than to offer so casually what men should be trying hard to earn. Because I see little girls here, some almost as young as 13 from the looks of things, taking a torch to their own innocence for a quick buck. I see their mothers or fathers letting it happen, and the men who partake. I'm here because I see my daughters all grown up when I look at your face, and how those amazing gifts to the world I raised deserve so much better than the best this lot could give or pay them. I'm here because the constable asked for volunteers to remove this stain bearing a facade of relation to our home. And I'm here because I was told by my friend what you all did to the man who came to you in peace with a simple demand on behalf of our community's leadership. The elders didn't tell me or the constable or any of my men here to do anything on behalf of themselves or God. We came here because we love our home, and we love you. We believe you and all those here deserve better than the literal stench and degradation of humanity shown in this place, even if we have to hammer it into you or drive you away to show it. I believe our God thinks you deserve more too, so I'll happily serve as an instrument of His if you believe that is the case. I hope that answers your question. There was a moment of pause that hovered between us, and it appeared to happen as she took in everything I said. The world outside our little bubble went on. Men carted women to rooms down the far halls or out the doors to the trailers, and the roar of laughter continued, while all the men of New Canaan stood beside their marks ready to act on their duty regardless of age or experience in a place like this. After a short few seconds, Callie the prostitute said, I told them the name wasn't a good idea. Momentarily puzzled, that part was what caught her attention. I looked at her and saw her face was still calm, even if that smile was shrunken slightly and colored with concern. I also want to let you know that I had nothing to do with the stuff that happened to that missionary guy yesterday afternoon. Not even addressing the stuff about the children I mentioned. I took that as something of a confirmation of my assumption, especially when she went on. I get it. I get your worry. I do. But just remember that there are a lot of women here that are going to have nothing and no way to support themselves if this is shut down, including yours truly. I met her eyes and her expression remained as I said, we weren't asking the owners to shut down. Our missionary told you all just to move and to change the name to something less offensive to us. She nodded, seeming to understand, yet still, she replied, asking to move is still the same as shutting down. The bosses can't just move a whole trailer park 8 miles south. Before she could say anything else, I interrupted her, feeling even more in control of what was happening in this place. Perhaps this sudden, sincere sternness in my demeanor was a sign that Lieutenant Camden was nearby. Either way, I told the woman directly, that is not our problem. There are other towns, neighborhoods, and service stations outside of our direct territory. Then she interrupted me, not angrily, not spitefully, just curiously, and as if she was still dealing with a somewhat disagreeable client. She said, but that'll cripple the market. I don't think those whelps in the refugee village will be able to make it so far, especially the gals. As she said this, I felt the nearly uncontrollable urge to laugh and scream, how that was exactly the point when she continued. The girls we have here don't have much other than their bodies to make money, and from everything I heard in the markets before this place was set up, is that New Canaan simply can't keep up with the demand of all the refugees. She paused, seeing what I was going to say had already died, and concluded, you aren't helping the women here by doing this, you're hurting them. Here, they have some power over their situation. She let this sink in the way it did after I spoke, but as appealing as it was to my reason and sensibilities, it wasn't enough. This place was a stain. I knew the elders and charity workers had contingencies in the event of charity shortages, and although I couldn't list them for certain immediately after she was done speaking, I thought of my daughter and my wife. Places like this told all women inside of New Canaan, and everyone we tried to help, that sometimes it was okay to degrade oneself. Sometimes it was all right to abandon faith that something will come along to rescue you from having to lower yourself to such a degree. That was something I could not believe. There was always something else, whether you could fathom what that something else is in the dark or not. I knew that firsthand, and I loved my wife, my daughters, the refugee women, and even this woman too much to let this monument to degradation stand. As I said, you can trick yourself into saying it's liberation or taking control of an unfortunate situation, but the truth is that it's pretending to assert some kind of control over some loss of innocence that happened long ago. Whether that loss was of your own volition or someone else's, the women here are not providing for themselves or their families. I won't have a place like this continue to tell my daughters and sisters of the community that a place like this can help in a bad situation, or empower them when I've seen faith rescue people in far worse predicaments time and again. Whether you hate me for it or not, I'll do what I can to destroy this opportunity for the women here to sell themselves and call it love, because that's what I feel it is. I want what's best for you too. And you deserve far better than this, because selling yourself is not power or control. It's sad. The woman looked as though she was going to say something else, but then stopped before it could escape her lips. She raised her shoulders a moment and then said, "I don't hate you." I turned back to the room but felt her eyes remain on the side of my face when she added, "I don't think I really agree with you." Again, she stopped before proceeding. "I also know how useless it is to argue with a man like you New Canaanite types." This made me smile for some reason I couldn't quite figure. I think it was because of some sort of strange understanding between two people who, like in the old days, could still befriend one another even if they didn't agree on topics like politics, religion, or things like that. All I could say after that was what was true. I'm sure there's plenty you could argue against what I've said, but there's yet another truth that hasn't been mentioned. She perked her ears, and her expression returned to the one she bore before my sermonizing. This is still New Canaan's territory. Our authority will not be questioned or challenged here. What we say goes, and the simple answer to everything you or the owners of this place could argue will boil down to our community's only answer: not under my roof. The woman brought her foot up to the wall she leaned upon, exposing a slightly tattered fishnet-covered knee out from under her coat, and after a long moment said casually, without that seduction from earlier, "Lansing." I returned my attention to her briefly. "Sorry?" Seeing she was still looking over the room, I resumed doing so as well, and she explained. "Lansing is the guy you and your friends will want to talk to about shutting this place down." I took this in, nodding to myself as she resumed. "I never caught his first name, but he's the caravan boss who set this place up. The guy's from California, but led a pretty big group out here. Good eye for business, even if he's younger than me." I asked, "He the one you came in with?" "Nah," said Callie nonchalantly before elaborating. "I came in with Mrs. Dottie Norton from the folks out by Carson City. She's usually pretty uptight for something like this, but she knows a good opportunity, and Lansing is pretty smart. The boy even got Gus and his crew from New Reno on this, and his boys are serving most of the protection." When she was done, I thought out loud, "So Mr. Lansing, Mrs. Norton, and Gus are the operators, huh?" I didn't recognize any of the names, but I would have known if Mr. Lansing was with Happy Trails Caravan Company, since both were from California. Our community would have had some strong words for Happy Trails if any of them were involved in this, since they were usually one of the more friendly trading outfits from out west. Either way, the woman replied, "Those are the big three, yeah." Callie adjusted herself against the wall. "But there's at least 10 other trading outfits from all over that contributed to this place, knowing they'd have to hold up here for the start of winter." I recited those names to myself in order to remember them later, but before either me or she could say anything else, I caught eyes with Doyle across the room, still at the table with Pryor. It appeared that only Nathan was gone from the table, and when I saw Doyle, I saw him make a motion with his head for me to come over. Without anything else, I pushed my back off the wall and said to my companion of the past 10 minutes, "Excuse me, I need to go, but it truly was nice talking to you." But before I could take a step, She stopped me in my tracks by saying, just as seductively as she did in her extraordinary offer to me alone, "Oh, no, you don't." I faced her and she added, "You forgot to pay me, sweetie." Her hands caressed my burly coat as her eyes looked me up and down like I was still a client of hers. With a confused expression, I told her, "I'm sorry. I don't believe you and I did anything you charge for." Still moving her hands up and down the length of my coat and speaking in that same tone, she said, "The fun stuff, no, but 10 minutes is 10 minutes. The part of me that wanted to argue was just as strong as the part that wanted to stuff her pocket full of money or bullets and get over to Doyle. However, before I could say anything or pull away from her grip that said I could not leave despite the delicacy of it, she said in almost a whisper, "You're a godly man. You don't want a sweet little thing like me to get hurt for wasting 10 minutes, right? Santos over there has been eyeing us pretty hard." I figured Santos was a bouncer who'd been watching us. But whether or not he was watching us, or whether or not she was lying about the possibility of her getting hurt for a conversation that didn't result in sex, I simply didn't know. What I did know was that I did consider myself a godly man, and she knew that whether she lied or not, I wouldn't allow even the possibility of physical harm to come to her. Reaching into my pocket, I withdrew a small jewelry sack that I knew contained 10 of our community's silver coins bearing the cross and placed it in her hands. Her eyes widened and she asked, "How much is in here? I was just going to charge you my standard rate." She released her grip on my coat and I replied, 10. Consider it compensation for your soon-to-be unemployment. That or proof. You don't need to sell yourself when something else can come along if you have a little faith." I winked at her, she pocketed the money and winked back at me. I don't know if she would ever leave the line of work she obviously enjoyed, but with that exchange, I believe I let her know that the opportunity to change was always there. She looked back out at the room and with her last words being, "I'll try to keep my head down," I stepped towards Doyle praying it wouldn't come to that. Chapter 21. Booted from Paradise, Part 3. I didn't think much of Callie's last words she left me with, and I didn't have long to think about it either because I was soon standing between Doyle and Pryor across from my men. John nodded at me from the other side of the table, and Ramos had a peculiar look on his face when he darted his gaze back toward the prostitute whose company I just departed. Looking back at me, I saw Ramos about to say something over the noise of the even more crowded establishment, when his thoughts of speaking were interrupted by a skinny white girl dressed a bit like Callie who sat on his lap. I believe the woman who sat on Ramos's lap said her name was Misty, but I gave it no mind and noticed the chair where Nathan sat was still empty when I felt Doyle pull on my coat. I lowered myself and he only said, "Go get a drink at the bar with Nathan and bring him back here, should be go time very soon." I was going to ask him what the signal was, or how soon till Camden arrived, but his only response was to make a gesture with his head toward the bar, and that was that. My youngest guardsman was still red in the face by the pretty girl sitting on his lap, but I knew he was in company that would keep him safe, so I proceeded towards the bar, leaving Mr. Schmidt a pat on the shoulder as I went. Weaving through the crowds, I was surprised that the place was even busier than when we arrived. Most of those indulging in the establishment's offerings weren't even sitting, and yet, there was still one empty seat right beside Nathan. Taking my seat beside my guardsman on the rickety stool, I would have resumed looking around the place to ensure all the men were in their stations. However, Nathan himself captured my attention when I saw he hadn't even glanced in my direction since I sat down. Although it was clear he had noticed my arrival beside him because the first thing he said to me after I sat down was, "Hey, Paul, what do you think a nasty nunnery is?" Bewildered by this, I replied automatically, "I have no idea. What?" I saw where he'd been staring since before I even sat down, and noticed the white chalk scribbled on a large blackboard, illuminated by 4 dim light bulbs on a shelf full of bottles. He said without diverting his focus from the blackboard for an instant, "I mean, I saw one gal in here wearing something like a nun outfit. Thought that was kind of cute." It's almost like the owners of this place have no idea New Canaan ain't Catholics and just mishmashed some generic Christian stuff into the theme of this place. I had noticed that, and even noticed 1 or 2 prostitutes in short blackish outfits. I figured that to be strange tribal garb while I was standing beside Callie, but now that it was mentioned, they did sort of look like nuns in a way. Then I recalled the few white crosses on the exterior walls of the building, while the interior was largely devoid of any reference to our home beyond the name of the place and the menu. Nathan went on, and I read the large board he was studying so meticulously that went something like 10 minutes, 4 new Canaan coins, 50 bullets 9mm up, or 59mm, 20 minutes, 9 new Canaan coins, 110 bullets 9mm or 110 9mm, Holy Trinity, 15 minutes, 11 new Canaan coins, 130 bullets 9mm up, or 139mm, Garden Snake Special, 20 minutes, photo included, proof required, 10 new Canaan coins, 120 bullets, Certified Canaanite, 10 minutes, virgin proof required, 2 new Canaan coins deal, Nasty Nunnery, 20 minutes, VIP, 12 new Canaan coins 150 bullets, 9mm plus equals 9mm. There was more. A lot more. So much so that the board on the wall was really hard to read. I figured the deals were something talked about with the women's clients themselves, and not something ordered from the menu. Either way, before I could explain to Nathan that I still had no idea about the answer to his question, I was confronted with one of the bartenders who only stood before me with a scowl on his face and a raised eyebrow. Before he could utter the "what you want," he clearly had on his lips. I told him bartender's choice. His face softened, and Nathan said with his attention still on the board, "Shouldn't have done that." "Explain," said I, seeing the bartender reach for something off the topmost shelf beside the services menu. "Look at him," said Nathan, nodding toward the bartender. "He's gonna stiff you." This wasn't news to me, nor was it the first time I had to buy alcohol in an establishment I wanted nothing to do with. I only told him, "I know." He shrugged, still squinting at the menu. "I almost want to try the Nasty Nunnery. You know, just out of curiosity." "Sure you don't want to take advantage of that deal for certified Canaanites? Might want to dip your toe in before you take a dive." "Can't, Paul. I'm not a virgin, remember? It says proof required." He thought for a moment, but how would they even prove that? By your social skills around the opposite sex, I'm assuming. That or the special is oriented towards our sisters within the wall. Easier to verify them. He chuckled. "Didn't see any males beyond customers here. Then again, maybe that's a point on its own." Speaking of which, before he could go any further, I interrupted him. "Before you go on about anything else, I need to know the sign." He looked at me in confusion for a moment and was going to answer me when he froze. I saw why he froze, and the bartender was standing across from me once again on the other side of the counter. With a small shot glass full of brown liquid between us, the bartender shouted over the noise of the room. "It's Brandywine's 1910 Arkansas whiskey, unopened since the bombs." There was a momentary pause before he nodded down towards the drink and added, "That'll be 4 Canaan coins." There was a smirk on his face, probably from knowing it was worth 10 minutes of Wastelander bliss. What most of the wasters in the room could only spend for the best 10 minutes of some of their lives, this bartender wanted to see if I would actually pay that for a single shot. The look on his face said that somehow he knew I would. Maybe he knew I was a new Canaanite, or maybe this was his way of testing to see if I was, or if I was just stupid. Either way, I looked him dead in the eye, knowing what we were only a few minutes away from doing to his employment, and handed him 6 new Canaan minted coins with the words, "Rest is for you, sir." The bartender let out a soundless laugh as he pocketed the money and went to turn away to serve other customers when my eyes alone prevented him from averting his gaze. Knowing he was watching me, I took the expensive shot glass and poured it out onto the already sticky countertop. The bartender broke his gaze with a confused and almost frightened look, and my attention went to Nathan as he said, "And there goes 4 silver pieces right onto the countertop. Then, here's a peasant like me with my muddy 2-bullet beer. What's the signal and when's it coming, Nathan?" I asked, returning to my demeanor from earlier. As per usual, it was hard to wrangle his attention. Seriously though, shame to waste that. I know he'll need the tip, but still. What's the signal? I asked him again, feeling that any second the signal could possibly come. He sighed and relented. 3 flickers of the light mean Camden's guys are in position. From there, it's up to us about go time. You taking the lead on this, by the way, or is Doyle? I gave my own sigh, thankful for the answer, and gave him my answer to his question. I am. Just keep calm till then. It'll all be fine so long as nobody sets anything off too early and keeps natural. Don't set things off too early? Stay natural? Asked Nathan, switching his focus back and forth from the board to me. You mean like drawing attention to ourselves by wasting expensive drinks? You're the one talking about spending his entire month's pay on a nasty nunnery, so don't get lippy with me. I knew he was going to say he was kidding about that, but I did owe him some explanation for why I did what I did. Still, what I did is good attention. The attention I showed says that we aren't here to be bought out. We're here for our demands to be taken seriously and not negotiated with when it's go time. He nodded in surrender, still reading that board as I wrangled his attention to prove my point. Look at him now, the bartender. Right now, he's being a good little employee and probably telling his bosses about the expensive services he rendered to me. Nathan's eyes went to the bartender standing on the far end of the bar and speaking to one of the female bartenders, as well as a man in a black overcoat. I paid them no mind, only explaining to Nathan. Doyle said Camden will be along any minute and I believe him. In the meantime, we still have a job to do till the lights flicker. The worst that would happen by my display to the bartender was probably a few questions from the establishment's owners or bouncers. However, in my experience, such a thing would likely just bring about questions like, "What else can we get you?" Since a customer who wastes expensive drinks might also waste money on other things as well. Still, as soon as I told Nathan that we had a job to do, his eyes went back to me from the bartender on the other end. However, he stopped when he saw something and replied, "What a coincidence, look at this." Speaking of job to do, he tilted his head forward. I turned my attention back to the chalkboard instead of where he was looking, and my guardsman stood himself up to confirm something I only suspected before sitting at the bar. I refused to bring this up earlier out of an attempt to blend into the crowd, but before I sat beside Nathan, I saw the backs of 2 younger men occupying the bar seats just to the left of the empty chair. There was something about their frames and their lowered heads that caused my suspicion, but I shrugged it off since I felt Nathan would have approached them earlier if they were New Canaanites. Perhaps Nathan tried to ignore their presence beside him in the packed bar out of knowing them. Or perhaps he was really so intrigued by the service's menu to notice them. Either way, when I reminded him of our job to do, he stood himself up and placed himself between the 2 young men on my left, putting an arm over both men's shoulders as I continued to read the board with a whisper to myself. Good man. My, it can't be. What on earth could bring little Hector Belts and Calvin Willett to a place like this? Could evening mission prep have let out early tonight? Came from Nathan on my left beneath the noise of the room. Nathan always cracked me up, and I took mental note of the names, while a smile curled my lips, and I continued to look at the board. "Hello to you too, Nathan," said one of the near men of our home who I thought might have been the Willett son. "You know evening mission prep is tomorrow night." I could feel Nathan staring deeply at both the faces under his wings, clearly enjoying this gotcha moment as he replied, "That's right. Must have slipped my mind. You boys don't get lots of free time. Figure it might be a good idea to get a couple of stiff drinks on a nice night off? Maybe lose that V-card before your first mission? When is that, by the way? Only a couple months to go, right?" "Start of March," said the voice of the other one, the Belts family's second son. "We're just here for drinks, that's all." "Well, at least I am." "What are you doing?" shouted the voice of Mr. Willett at his friend. Both young men lowered their heads, revealing a crazy-looking grin on the face of Nathan in my peripherals. "Is that so, Mr. Calvin Willett?" asked Nathan, making sure to pronounce the name in its fullest and apparently enjoying this too much. "What in the world would your mother say about this? And what about Laura Mileto? I don't think she'll be too sweet on you after hearing where you spend your free time. You're one to talk, Nathan, shouted Calvin as he raised his head. You lost your virginity on mission. That's worse. I knew Nathan did some off-shift work with some of the young adults of missions coordination a couple times a month. As this scene played out, I couldn't tell you why exactly, but I found this confrontation between my guardsman of 24 and his friends, who'd yet to even take their first mission, so amusing. At the accusation from Calvin Willett, Nathan's resolution remained stern and authoritative, even if his words would have had me crying in laughter in another situation. And I still write letters to Aliana Matuskrona every month. You gonna keep in touch with one of these floozies? Despite the shouting, us new Canaanites at the bar were in our own isolated world, as the noisy one outside our bubble paid no mind to any of this drama. The Willett son was going to say something else, but a violent motion of the hand from Nathan kept Calvin Willett in silence. Then the head of Hector Belts rose. Why are you here, Nathan? What could bring you to this place when you're off duty? The demeanor of both young men cooled, seemingly having caught Nathan as well. Nathan released his grip on the men, stood himself more upright, and replied simply, I'm on duty now. Oh yeah? Said the Willett son accusingly. We all know you get off when the day shift ends at 6, so why's it 9 p.m. right now? The young men seemingly felt satisfied until Nathan's short defense turned into another offense as a smile grew across his face once more. I'm on a special assignment. See that man beside you, Calvin? You know who that is? I kept my eyes forward but removed the amusement from my expression as the two faces beneath Nathan went to me. When both young men were looking at me, Nathan added, That's my boss, Lieutenant Paul Young. I'm sure you know his daughter from missions coordination. Say hi, fellas. I could only see their faces in my peripherals, but they weren't wearing good ones as they both said slowly, Hello, Mr. Lieutenant Young, and hello, Michelle's dad together. My focus remained on the bar, Hello, boys, and Nathan leaned in, saying softer than before, You think he's here for fun and drinks? You think Lieutenant Doyle, Pryor, and their men are here for a day shift team-building activity? The return of Nathan's arms around the young men's shoulders prevented them from seeing where the men he spoke of sat. The young men didn't answer the question, and the dim lights across the establishment flickered 3 times very noticeably in the space of 2 seconds. The men's silence lingered. I saw some employees of the establishment make for the exit from a back room, likely to investigate the short power hiccup. And just then, I was prompted to settle this matter before settling the last one for the night. Boys, finish your drinks and leave. You have 15 seconds. With Nathan's arms still draped over the shoulders of both young Canaanites, they did as I said, and swallowed the rest of their drinks in less than 5 seconds. I added coolly, Good, now leave immediately. I won't tell your parents where you've been, but I also won't lie if they come asking, and that's the best deal you'll get from anyone else in the Guard. Nathan allowed the young men to stand, and he took his place by my side as I stood as well. After leaving me with a subtle, thank you, Lieutenant Young, Mr. Willett, and Mr. Belts were already moving hastily towards the exit by the time I rose to my feet. Nathan's face was back to business, and knew without word that the only reason I let them off with a warning was because I didn't deem alcohol consumption to be worthy of ruining their first mission, especially because they didn't engage in this place's other services. By the time the men were walking out the doors, I looked to Nathan and told him plainly, Let's get to Doyle and finish this. I'm ready to go home. The employees who went to check the power generators out back never returned, and Nathan and I stepped up to Doyle, Pryor, Mr. Schmidt, John, and Ramos. By this time, the girl had departed from Mr. Ramos's lap, and the men sat eager to go, even if they were in the middle of something. It appeared that John, Ramos, and Mr. Schmidt were engaged in a deep discussion and paid no mind to Nathan and I's arrival. Once I stepped between Doyle and Pryor, I gave one last look over the scene. Hordes of dirty wastelander men filled the room. Women carted men to and fro. And the noise was so loud as the persistent smell of this place continued to fill my nose. Then I remembered something from before and looked through the crowds, seeing just through a small gap where those young girls were still huddled in the corner. I couldn't tell if any had left since I first noticed them on my walk over to Cali, but the possibility of them being made to sell themselves still persisted, and I leaned down to Doyle. "Hey, Doyle, you see those young girls in the corner over there?" He broke his attention from the conversation between the guardsmen at the table and immediately knew where to look. He apparently read my mind. "I don't know for sure either. Want to put some guys over there to figure things out? We can start whenever, so you make the first move, Paul." I nodded in acknowledgement and said to him without thinking about it, "I'll have John, Ramos, and Duncan move over there immediately when it starts." Doyle only said, "Agreed," and nodded, turning his attention back to the conversation, as I was already moving around the table to inform the appropriate men. Once this was done, I stood between John and Nathan's chairs, looking at Doyle across the table, and I didn't even need to ask. Over the laughing and indistinct chatter from all the voices around us, Doyle said, "As soon as this talk is over, I'm ready." Lieutenant Pryor beside him laughed, and both men turned back towards John, who was speaking. I hadn't caught more than a few bits of the conversation between the men at the table since I returned, but it was evidently very much about the purpose of this establishment. All I really caught was the end when John Langdon was saying to Duncan across from him, "Does that make sense? Just imagine being in a field all day in 100-degree weather, your wife on the loom the whole time, no air conditioning, and the last time you, your wife, and all of your neighbors bathed was 2 months ago. If you're a man obsessed with sex, and you can get over the smell of all that dirt and sweat and funk and still think about sex with fondness, you're probably not someone an Israelite would want to hang around with. No better than this lot here. Get it? Yeah, I get it. Just doesn't normally feel that way. Also doesn't really explain some of the other feelings I get around places like this," said Duncan, almost inaudibly through the noise. "Ha," laughed John. "What do you mean? I saw that sour look on your face every time someone passed behind you, even when that gal sat on your lap 10 minutes ago." "But what do you mean when you say other feelings exactly?" Ramos began to say something, but I couldn't focus because my attention immediately went to Doyle and Pryor when they turned to look up at the burly bald man standing between them. My attention went entirely to them when they stood, and I was already at their side on the opposite end of the table by the time my fellow lieutenants were on their feet. The conversation had ended in a moment, and a brief glance back at the table showed vacant chairs and my 3 men already maneuvering towards the young girls in that far corner. I turned back to the man across from Doyle and Pryor, seeing the crowd around us had dispersed, and revealed 2 other thuggish men with bandoliers across their torsos and beneath thick leather jackets. The thugs looked at me briefly when I inched closer to Doyle, and then I heard the bald one in the middle say to the 3 of us with a sneer, "You 3 and your friends need to order more drinks or some girls or leave. You and your table have been here too long to still be on 1 drink, and we don't tolerate loiterers." "Who are you? The owner?" shouted Lieutenant Pryor in his best fake drunk voice. The bouncer said, "No, we're the janitors. We take out the trash and keep this place clean of freeloaders." "Well, let us speak to the owners then," said Doyle, not even pretending to be intoxicated. The thugs of this place clearly didn't have much tolerance or patience for anything, because the bald one said in an instant, "Nah, I think you and your men have stayed past your welcome. Leave now." To emphasize their point, the 3 bouncers all lifted the bottom of their jackets to expose large caliber pistols, as if to say they were more than willing to use them to earn their pay. At the sight of these weapons and in direct defiance of the sinister faces those men wore, Doyle said in all his wonder, "Well, this is outrageous." He took 1 step back. "Something like this makes my friends and I so angry we could just stand on a table in protest of such treatment." As I stepped up onto the table, I saw the faces of the bouncers go from menacing to shock when Doyle and Pryor took out their own guns, and even more so when I drew mine. Pointing the gun at the ceiling, I fired 3 times, bringing the entire room to silence beneath the burst of the weapon. The fragments of debris floated slowly down from the ceiling, and after less than a millisecond of pure silence, the place was engulfed in chaos as the weapons of all the guardsmen in the establishment were drawn at once. Wasters and prostitutes fled out of the building screaming while the jukebox was unplugged and my gun stayed above my head. As the building emptied, some wasters drew their own weapons. briefly aiming them at me before realizing why the establishment's janitors weren't drawing their own weapons to defend against this apparent hold-up. Then those heroic wasters saw the men holding guns to the heads of the bouncers and removed me from their sights at the orders spoken throughout the room. "Holster your weapon and leave. This doesn't concern you." The armed wasters all decided it best to not play hero and complied with the demand, vacating the establishment as the last of the general populace fled out into the cold December night. The bald bouncer who set off the operation was the only one still aiming a gun at me when the last customers were on their way out, but his gaze went all over the room, wondering why his men weren't doing anything before seeing the situation for what it truly was. All the establishment's customers were gone, and the place was vacant save for 12 thugs each with a gun trained on their person, and 3 wasters forming a perimeter around that corner full of young girls. There I stood, and when I met the eyes of the bald thug, he lowered his weapon, prompting me to ask, "Can I speak to the owners?" Before the thug could utter a word, a muffled voice came from a back room next to the bar. "What's going on out there? What happened?" The voice needed no answer because less than a few seconds later, the door opened, and out came a young man in a long faux fur coat over a dirty suit top with jeans. Following him and taking her place beside the young man was a woman of what looked to be around 40-ish with glasses and a perm who I assumed to be Mrs. Dottie Norton. Then lastly was a muscly bald man built almost exactly like some of the bouncers wearing face tattoos, and was who I presumed to be the man called Gus that Callie referred to. The 3 took their spots in the center of the room between my co-lieutenants and the thugs before them when the thugs fell back. The bartenders were frozen in place behind the counter, and when the owners came to a halt at the center of the room, the bartender from earlier said aloud, "That guy, there on the table, he's the one who wasted the drink." Gus shot a look at the bartender, "Shut up," then looked around at all his men, "Why aren't you firing?" before seeing the guns placed on each of the thugs. At last, I lowered my weapon from the ceiling and adjusted my footing on the tabletop as I met the eyes of the young owner in the suit ensemble. "You Lansing?" The near kid adjusted the flaps on his coat and said in almost a yawn, "Yeah, that's me. What do you want and why are you shooting holes in my bar? Is this a stick-up or something?" I was already almost entirely disgusted by the fact a boy like this was running such a place and running it so well. This was the largest operation of this kind to open up in the Christmas season in probably 6 or so years. I briefly thought about the owner of the wagon last year, who was a rather kind and understanding mustachioed man who was agreeable to such a degree that we almost let him continue his mobile sex camper business there, outside the market. Still, this place, the popularity and the demeanor of all involved were what shook me back to reality, and I replied to the young man in an instant, "We're here on behalf of our home to close this place, and I hear you're the one responsible for the enterprise." The young man put his hands in his pockets. "You must be that high priest Mordecai or whatever," said the kid, and my brain almost short-circuited at his assumption, thus preventing me from speaking anything before he added, "That's why you interrupted our little party back there?" Gus and I were having a good time, except Mrs. Dottie here. I didn't know what to make of that before he clarified. "Girls, come out. You're done for the night." 3 half-dressed prostitutes ran out of the back room, into the hallway, and disappeared in only a few seconds, likely disappearing into a storage closet or something, as Mr. Lansing said. "Sorry, I like business meetings to be entertaining, Mrs. Norton." The trembling woman beside him in the dusty suit and large glasses kept looking at me like I was there to punish her specifically. Either way, I realized I didn't care about any of this, so I spoke up immediately. "With the authority of our home, the constable, bishop, and the elders of our temple, we're demanding you close your business. In light of what you all had done to our emissary, we're demanding you comply without negotiation, and without the compensation originally offered." I saw Gus clench his fists a bit tighter, looking around the room as if to tell his men to ignore the guns to their heads and fire anyway. Mrs. Dottie trembled a bit more, and looked like there was a little more sweat on her face after the demand. Mr. Lansing, on the other hand, kept his casual demeanor, but my order clearly affected him as he said in something I could only describe as a calm panic, "Look, What happened to your emissary? What happened to that guy wasn't our fault. Neither me nor Mrs. Dottie, not even Gus, had that guy Daryl beaten up. I broke my focus from Mr. Lansing at the sound of the front door opening, and a brief glance behind showed it was Lieutenant Camden, who'd entered with a new Canaan 45 SMG in hands. He said aloud, "Lieutenant Young, Doyle, Pryor, I got 12 of my boys surrounding the place. All's quiet at the moment. The crowd's at bay." Pryor and Doyle looked back at him, and Pryor said, "Thanks, Camden. Stand by for now." The front door gave the sound of opening but did not close, and Pryor glanced back at me. "Go ahead, Young." Still thinking about what Lansing had said despite the entrance of Camden, I thought of what I knew happened to Daryl Fleischer of Missions Outreach when he came here yesterday. The bottom line was that I didn't know much, and he wasn't in much condition to tell about it from what I heard about how he ended up. I suppose it was possible that the owners had nothing to do with Daryl's condition, but that was irrelevant. I looked at the owners' faces, thought of how it wasn't their fault, and asked, "That's so?" Lansing shrugged his shoulders, his voice returning to indifference as he answered, "Yeah, the guy got up and started telling Mordecai or whoever's demands to everyone at the bar there. Our customers decided to handle him the way a mob would if you try to take away a dog's bone. I suppose Gus's guys could have done more to stop it, but you can't put down a mob like that." "Yes, you can," I said automatically while thinking, "I've seen Graham do that on his very own less than a few weeks ago." A momentary pause ensued before Lansing glanced at his business partners and said to me, "Either way, you go tell your elders or whatever what happened, and I'll give Mr. Fleischer's original offer another once over." I didn't know if I had the authority to comply with the negotiation, and wondered if the elders and constable would be willing to negotiate if they decided to believe in the owner's innocence. My thoughts of returning with the owner's response were put to rest, and I realized the only truth I needed to know about the situation when Mr. Lansing added after a moment, "But you can leave now." No. Whether or not they were an innocent party in what happened to Daryl Fleischer was irrelevant. Our demands were a mere nuisance to them, something to subvert or something to delay. I glanced back at the corner of the room where the little girls stood, frightened, barely clothed, and despite the question of their exploitation remaining unanswered, I could not tolerate even the possibility as I thought of everything said to Callie and everything I'd seen since entering this place. I took the authority upon myself and said to Mr. Lansing, "The new offer stands." The look of boredom on Mr. Lansing's face dropped to one of frustration or annoyance before he said, "And what if we don't accept the new offer?" The room fell even more silent, the only noise being the muffled crowds and their indistinct chatter beyond the windows and beyond the perimeter of Camden's men. I looked to all the faces holding the thugs at bay. Each one, no matter how young, was making me proud by their expression alone. All men of New Canaan in that room, no matter how experienced or inexperienced, bore the look of one ready to defend their God and their home, no matter the cost, with vicious intensity. They all looked as though they were the embodiment of Graham's ruthless sermon, and the brutality of what mercy can sometimes look like if tested too much. "And what if you don't accept the new offer?" I asked Mr. Lansing to reiterate. His only response was a nearly imperceptible nod. At that, I told him, "Well then, tomorrow we're going to ask you to shut down and move far away from New Canaan once more." A great laughter erupted throughout the room, laughter even from the bouncers with my men's guns placed to their heads and backs. Apparently, this was enough to calm the bag of nerves called Mrs. Dottie Norton, who despite her ongoing trembling was able to vocalize her amusement at such an inconsequential threat. All the while, the faces of every guardsman throughout the room had not changed in their intensity at all. I seemed to feel the eyes of all the men of New Canaan throughout the room at once in a single second, as if to tell me to go on. Before I could, Mr. Lansing subdued his laughter and asked me, "That's it? You'll ask us again?" "Yes, but tomorrow morning there will be 50 of us, all with automatic weapons, and explosive charges already set up throughout the compound. Some of Lieutenant Camden's men should be on the explosives part now." All the laughter throughout the room had died completely by the time I finished the last syllable. The latter detail was true. Although I couldn't tell where they installed every piece of C4 and dynamite throughout the trailer park exactly, that task was one only myself and the other lieutenants knew about. It surprised me how not even this detail made the faces of my men waver in any conceivable way. The message was true, and one that cemented our resolution. We will be peaceful with you and treat you fairly, but you will not push us. The thought of blowing up a building full of innocent or lost people was heartbreaking to us, and one we prayed we would never have to do. Although the explosives have come out for situations like this in the community's past, there have thankfully never been any recorded occasions where it was detonated. After all, the important thing is hardly ever what you would do. The important thing is what the enemy thinks you would do. If the tone in which I spoke, or the faces of my men didn't say how serious we were, the guns to the heads of so many thugs by otherwise peaceful men did. Either way, the threat or the mere possibility of the threat being carried out evidently worked, because after everything went silent, Mr. Lansing said in a tone of seriousness I hadn't heard from him yet, "You want tribute or a tax or something?" All I said was the word no in a voice devoid of all threat or intensity. The young owner began to nervously stamp his foot as he joined Gus in looking from guard to guard, as if to beg one of them to resist. Probably even more frustrated by the one-word answer I gave, he said frustratedly, "Please, are you sure? Surely we can work something out. There's a lot of people invested in this place and we literally just broke even." I cut him off, deciding it to be more fun to look at the bartender across the room from earlier as I spoke. "There is nothing to negotiate. We want this shut down. It will be shut down. The terms are non-negotiable. You can either comply at this very moment or enjoy your last night of operation, knowing that tomorrow you may not be in a condition to comply after the morning when we return." Again, the young man looked all around the room, seeing all the men under his employ with guns to their heads, and then back at me knowing there were explosives already installed around the compound that the man on the table was more than willing to use. I still prayed the young man would not call me on our willingness to explode a compound full of people, but I believe he knew that the explosives were a last resort in case they could hold their own against the 50-plus new Canaanites with automatics out in the desert. At last, Mr. Lansing stomped his young foot on the ground as if to put a hole in the floorboard and shouted, "Fine." I would have smiled in satisfaction if I had any less control over myself. Gus stood there with his mouth agape, either too angry or too upset by the loss of probably his greatest business venture. Mrs. Dottie continued her nervous convulsion, and then Lansing exploded with a finger pointed at me. "You're making a big mistake, though. I hope you realize that. You don't even know who I am. You'd know my dad if you religious freaks ever left this wilderness shithole. My dad's a councilman. NCR got no tolerance for those who don't allow free trade in or out of their territory." As the frustrated young man paused to catch his breath, I explained coolly, "And New Canaan has no tolerance for visitors who refuse our rules within our territory, especially when those visitors create a racket for exploiting women and even little girls." Lansing was going to say something halfway through my statement, but stopped when I uttered the last part. His eyes went to the corner, his face deadened, and he barked, "Whatever. NCR will hear about this, though." As I took a step down from the table, I took his non-answer about the little girls as its own answer. And on cue, every guardsman throughout the room pulled the pistols from the belts of the thugs before them. While Mr. Lansing continued stomping his foot and fuming, I replied to him, "And New Canaan will tell NCR what happened, if they aren't too busy in the Mojave to deal with the tantrum of a councilman's son." It took every part of me to not refer to Mr. Lansing as a councilman's spoiled brat in my closing words. The rest of Doyle, Pryor, and my men filed towards the door. Pryor saying to the room, "You all will find your guns in a bag off the caravan road." I said, "Y'all should start packing up now. We'll be back to check your progress in the morning," while Lansing and Gus continued to fume, and John, Duncan, and Ramos led the 12 little girls out into the cold asking about their parents. The next morning. I didn't mean to lie at the time, but it turns out we weren't able to muster 50 bodies the morning after. Then again, I only said that there were going to be 50 of us if they didn't agree to the terms. By the time we left the sack of 13 handguns by the green sign saying, "Paradise 1 mile this way," we could see the hordes of wasters leaving and the neon sign shutting off. So, instead of the 50 suggested, there were only a little over 30 of us standing in the middle of the desert, all with our automatics and long rifles. And me with a pair of binoculars, satisfied that the closing of that brothel was still underway. A few of the employees from either Lansing, Gus, or Mrs. Dottie's caravans were pulling out the signs along the road to that trailer park, and after a few moments to ensure our presence was known. I saw a man atop a trailer look our way and wave us down. I waved back with my binoculars to my eyes and knew our job was done when the unknown employee ceased his waving and held up a special finger towards me. I felt a euphoric sense of relief, and with the pack-up still underway, I turned to the men all mustered there in the desert and said, "Looks like we're good to go, boys." Although it may not have been the most exciting shutdown for a business like that in the history of New Canaan, I was more than relieved that it went so smoothly in spite of the potential for going so wrong. I never learned for sure if Mr. Lansing and Gus moved their business 8 miles south or not. The next 2 hours after we left our confrontation with the owners was spent reuniting the young girls with their families. It turned out that some of those girls were just standing in that corner while their mothers or sisters worked for the brothel, but some of them refused to talk, or couldn't, because of language reasons, talk about why they were there. Either way, the children who didn't have parents or had parents of an abusive nature were taken to the gates of New Canaan. Some of the translators from the refugee village or missions outreach interviewed the children, and by the end of the night, 6 of them were adopted by the community. There was a lot that went into that, but by the time midnight came around, I was returning home. I told my wife I would tell her all about the assignment later, and that was what I did after the early morning part was over, and I was allowed some additional time to rest. In the end, I don't know what happened to Mr. Lansing or Gus. It was evident amongst the wasters who came to us for the winter that they were very upset by the shutdown, while others just felt like they got what they wanted out of the place and were indifferent to the shutdown. Strangely enough, it was about a week later that I got to speak to Mrs. Dottie Norton and some of her people when I was doing one of my patrols around the market. Mrs. Dottie seemed genuinely remorseful for taking part in the brothel venture with Lansing and Gus, and told me she was about to leave and continue on with her caravan's original destination, despite the onset of winter. I told the poor woman that there was seriously no malice towards her and her part in the brothel setup, that all was forgiven, but she insisted on leaving when her mules and people were winter ready. It was actually during this talk that Miss Callie Carson came up, and I got to speak with her again. Callie still refused my invitation to come to New Canaan, but thanked me for not turning the shutdown into a bloodbath. I gave all the credit to God and reminded her of the offer to see what we're truly all about. A little bit of light showed when she said she would think about it after she was done with the business in Hanksville. Apparently, some guy paid a fortune and waited for more than 8 months to have Callie Carson and her colleague Miss Misty Pross visit with him at his home in Hanksville. The man said he was a huge fan of their shared work in the movie from New Reno called A Tale Between Two Leggies, or something horrible like that. Either way, I departed the company of Mrs. Dottie, Callie, and Misty, warning them that the region around Hanksville was reportedly very dangerous with Legion expansion. I'd never see any of them again, but although that could have been for any number of reasons, I tried not to think of the bad ones. In any event, Christmas was only a week away after that conversation, and after the kind of year I had, I was glad it could end on such a nice note, and without any bloodshed during the final operation of the year. Although things were bright in my life, the world around my home sat alone in the dark, and after such a year full of good and bad, I was more eager than most years to celebrate the birth of that light. It was only a tragedy that this incident sat as the formal end of a relatively peaceful period. Everything I've talked about in the world outside, all the problems, all the enemies, and all of that mess coming for us and the burned man was still inching closer, and nobody but God could understand what that would look like or how to stop it.